The linguist Noam Chomsky tells us, quote, "The smart way to keep people passive and obedient is to strictly limit the spectrum of acceptable opinion, but allow very lively debate within that spectrum. Even encourage the more critical and dissident views. That gives people the sense that there's free thinking going on, while all the time the presuppositions of the system are being reinforced by the limits put on the range of debate." That's Noam Chomsky. Let's talk about it. Stay tuned.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.
Welcome to the Connecting the Dots podcast with Dr. Wilmer Leon, and I am Wilmer Leon. Is this what American mainstream media and those in Western established press are engaging in? Actually, the violation of the First Amendment? Let's discuss this. Here's the point. We have a tendency to view current events as though they occur in a vacuum, failing to understand the broader historic context in which these events occur. During each episode of this podcast, my guests and I, we have probing, provocative, and in-depth discussions that connect the dots between these events and the broader historic context in which they occur. This enables you to better understand and analyze the events that impact the global village in which we live. On today's episode, the issue before us is very simple. The First Amendment, freedom of speech, and the U.S. government's attack on this inalienable right. And my guest is a U.S. labor and human rights lawyer, writer, author, and activist. His latest book is entitled The Case for Palestine, Why It Matters and Why You Should Care. He has been a peace activist throughout his life. He has been deeply involved in the movement for peace and social justice in Colombia, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and other countries in the global South. He's also taught international human rights law at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law since 2012. He is Professor Dan Kovalik. Dan, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Always a pleasure, Wilmer.
So there are a number of events. We're going to connect a number of dots here, but let's start with the First Amendment. And it reads as follows. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of people to peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Dan, we take this as Americans, we take this for granted. But as the First Amendment of the first 10, this one was very important and made number one for a reason. Why?
Well, because the founding fathers, having come from, England, where there was a king who was able to, prescribe speech arbitrarily, wanted to protect the right of free speech, the right of religion. Of course, England had a state religion, the Anglican Church, and they wanted to make sure that Americans had the right to such things as speech and religion and freedom of the press. In England, those things were not protected. Even to this day, by the way, Great Britain does not have a written constitution and does not protect those types of rights in the way that the United States does.
And again, we've taken this right for granted for so many years, but we have found history shows us, particularly during times of war, when the United States feels that it is being threatened, the screws tighten on free speech. Hence, people get charged with sedition and other types of violations when the government feels it's being threatened, when there is a perceived threat from outside the country. Then the government will tend to tighten the screws, restrict speech, and then once that threat is vanquished, then the prohibitions relax. Have you found history to prove that to be true?
Yes, I mean, one of the most famous examples, of course, is during World War One. People like Eugene V. Debs, great socialist from Terre Haute, Indiana. He was put in jail for publicly opposing World War One, and famously, his persecution and those of others like him was approved by the Supreme Court in a famous case by Oliver Wendell Holmes, who's one of the most celebrated jurists. And he created the clear and present danger rule. And what that says is that the First Amendment is not, as they often say, it is not the U.S. Constitution is not a suicide pact. He said that in cases of a clear and present danger, Congress, in fact, could limit speech. He gave the famous example of you're not allowed to yell fire in a crowded theater, for example. And he compared, incredibly, advocating for peace during a time of war as tantamount to claiming there's a fire in a crowded theater. And that remains the law of the day. And so that law, or that decision, which is now almost 100 years old, I think sets the precedent that advocating for peace in the United States is somehow a clear and present danger. And so, when we look to how speech is being regulated and limited today, what we often see it being regulated when people are clamoring for peace.
There's an interesting piece in Consortium News entitled Free Speech and the Department of Political Justice, and it's written by former Judge Andrew Napolitano, who was a Superior Court judge in New Jersey. And he writes in this piece, I don't want to spend a lot of time getting into the weeds of the First Amendment, but I think this is very germane to what we find ourselves dealing with. He writes, the framers of the Constitution were debating this idea of free speech, and they concluded, quote, that expressive rights are natural to all persons, no matter where they are born, and natural rights are, as Jefferson had written in the Declaration of Independence, inalienable. That's why I refer to them as inalienable rights in the open. Stated differently, he writes, Madison and his colleagues gave us a Constitution and a Bill of Rights that on their face recognized the pre-political existence of the freedom of speech and of the press in all persons and guaranteed that in Congress, by which they meant the government could not and would not abridge them until now. And he, in his piece, he's referencing some charges that the United States government has imposed against some Americans and some Russians. And it's not even a matter of challenging war as much as it is challenging the established government narrative. Your thoughts? Yes.
So again, this is very similar to laws and regulations that have come down before during World War I, and also around the same time. You had the Palmer raids against socialist and union leaders. Of course, you had the McCarthy period, which also really represented an abridgment of peace, of speech. And of course, very, I think, relevant to today, because of course the McCarthy period, at least ostensibly, involved the persecution of communists, though of course a lot of people persecuted were not communists, though a lot of the people who were persecuted were communists, most notably in my mind, the great Paul Robeson, he and I went to the same law school, by the way. It's a big reason I went to Columbia Law School, is because Paul Robeson went there, one of my heroes.
He was a few years ahead of you, though.
A few years, yeah. I know I look old, but I'm not quite old enough to cross paths with Mr. Robeson. But why is that important? Because, of course, that involved claims that the communists were somehow stooges of the Soviet Union. And now, of course, you have people making allegations that those opposing U.S. foreign policy are pawns of Russia and Vladimir Putin, right? So it's the same old trope that we've been hearing for years and years and years. And we see this manifested in the last 2 weeks with the Justice Department announcing indictments against people associated with RT, formerly known as Russia Today News, based in Moscow. You had Anthony Blinken's statements over the weekend that RT should be considered an espionage organization. That means a spy organization. And of course, the implication being that those Americans that work with it are spies. And then you had Hillary Clinton chiming in, I believe yesterday.
Yes.
Saying that people spreading propaganda, Russian propaganda, should be, civilly, if not criminally, prosecuted. And so, again, welcome to McCarthyism 2.0. It's a very scary time for people who, I'll just say like me, I'll only speak for myself, who want to advocate for peace, but also specifically advocate for peace with Russia, who say Russia's not our enemy, who go to Russia. I've been to Russia 5 times in the last 2 years. I've been to the Donbass 3 times, to Crimea once, to the Kherson region of what was Ukraine once. And I have worked with RT, and proudly so. And but I and others like me are now in the crosshairs of the U.S. government, and they're not even hiding it. They're being very clear that we are enemy number 1 at this point.
And this is important for people to understand because, again, as you just mentioned, they've indicted 2 Americans living in Russia who are Russian citizens. They work for RT. The feds are accusing them of spreading propaganda. And what they are basically doing is they're challenging the narrative of the Biden administration. And unlike what transpired during World War I, as you talked about Eugene Debs, and also what happened during World War II, right now, last I checked, the United States has not declared war on Russia. So we are not in a war footing or on a war footing right now. These are individuals that, and I am one, who is challenging the narrative of the Biden administration as it relates to what's going on in Ukraine, as it relates to what's going on with China over Taiwan, what's going on in Venezuela, what's going on in the Middle East. There are a number of areas where I believe, and I think I have historic and current evidence to support the position that the established stated narrative of the administration is flat out wrong.
Yes, absolutely. And again, Anthony Blinken was very specific about that. He said that RT, that its alleged propaganda has undermined the cause of the war in Ukraine. But as you say, while the U.S. is de facto at war with Russia, it is not officially at war with Russia.
Correct.
It is not declared war on Russia. And as you know, the U.S. rarely declares war anymore. It's only Congress can declare war. And rarely does it do that. We usually go to war, again, not officially, unofficially with countries without declaring war. So we are not officially at war with Russia, which means that those who work with Russia or Russia-related entities are not engaged in sedition of any kind. But that is what is being claimed now. I mean, that is being specifically claimed, that we are, in fact, involved in sedition. And by the way, I know people, Wilmer, friends of mine that are fleeing the country.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah, a number of people. And some to Russia, but some to other places, Canada, other places, for fear they're going to be prosecuted because of their work with RT. And no, it's very serious. I know several people, I won't name them. I think I can name one because he's already done it, so he's safe there, and that's Jackson Hinkle.
Oh, okay.
And but there's others in the process of doing that. Some people have urged me to do that. So we have a very serious situation, and I understand why people would make that choice, because really, the government is signaling that they may go after us. So it makes some sense.
And we're going to get to that with you in just a few moments, because there are a number of facets of this that, if you look at these things individually, people may have a tendency to think, oh, well, this is just a one-off here or a one-off there. But when you start connecting these dots, what you find out is the government is engaged in incredibly fascist behavior, and they are establishing policies. When Hillary Clinton, former Secretary of State, former First Lady, comes on television and starts talking about people who are spewing propaganda need to be considered for facing criminal charges. What's the difference between her saying that here in the United States and some of the incredibly repressive policies that have been and are in place by some people that she and other members of the current administration label as dictators, label as strongmen, label as fascists?
No, I mean, of course, there's no difference. I mean, and think about it. The U.S. has Voice of America, which, again, openly broadcasts U.S. Viewpoints around the world, and in particular in countries that are hot, that the U.S. is hostile towards. Radio Liberty is a similar one in Europe. But, frankly, you don't even have to point to those, because now, frankly, most of the U.S. media operates like those. They're nothing but mouthpieces for the U.S. government. I would put NPR in that category, CNN, MSNBC. And, of course, the iron, and if those stations or those broadcasting systems are jammed in other countries, or people associated with those entities are arrested or persecuted, of course, the U.S. is the first one to claim foul, right? But, of course, the other irony here is that MSNBC, which is the station that Hillary Clinton made her statements on, and Rachel Maddow, they have been propagandists themselves, in terms of pushing these lies about Russian interference. They've been pushing these lies for 8 years now. And Hillary Clinton herself was one of the main origins of that lie, which has been debunked.
Right.
Almost entirely. And right, so they are pushing propaganda, and they are pushing war propaganda, again, specifically against Russia. They themselves are guilty of war propaganda, which is, by the way, a war crime under international law. But so they're, talk about calling the kettle black, or in fact, they're calling the China plates black, when they're the ones that are engaged in propaganda.
In fact, I'm trying to pull it up right now. There's an NBC story from a while ago, from 2022, where they admitted to using propaganda to fool American people. And in fact, the author of the story is journalist Ken Delanian, who, by the way, I believe had been dismissed from the LA Times because he was clearing stories through the CIA before the stories were being submitted to his editors at the LA Times. But that's history. But there was a story back from 2022 where NBC admitted that they're involved in this propaganda war with Russia, and that they will lie to the American people in order to get out in front of a story before the Russians can tell the story, or to mislead the Russians. And so the United States government admits it does it to the American people itself.
All the time. We know this happens all the time. Another classic case was Judith Miller at the New York Times, who was doing nothing but writing CIA propaganda at the behest of the CIA, which helped lead us to the war in Iraq. And in fact, the CIA credited her reporting for helping pave the way to the war with Iraq. And of course, one of the big lies of the war, the weapons of mass destruction, was a lie that she promoted. And incredibly, she's landed on her feet. She was let go or forced to resign for the New York Times because that came out, but now she works for CNN. I mean, these folks, it's really not a negative mark on their career if they do this sort of thing. John Stockwell, just mentioned John Stockwell. I don't know if you remember him.
I do.
But he was a CIA bureau chief in Angola, and he talked about how the CIA would write stories that they would have published in the press. And he gave one example. He said we once wrote a story about Cuban troops who were fighting U.S.-backed forces in Angola, and who, by the way, helped liberate Southern Africa and South Africa, as you know, Wilmer.
Mm-hmm.
He said they would claim Cuban troops had raped these women in Angola. Then they'd write a story saying the Cuban troops were, killed. And then he said, incredibly, they'd write another story about the same Cuban troop unit somehow revived from the dead doing something else. And yet the press printed it without question, right? And this happens, and Hollywood's the same way. Hollywood is very much under the sway of the CIA. If I can just give one example of that famous, interesting example. If you've ever seen the movie, which I like quite a bit, Meet the Parents, pretty funny movie. There's a scene in which Ben Stiller, the main character, goes into Robert De Niro's lair for the first time and discovers he's with the CIA. Originally, the script had it that he found he was with the CIA because there was a CIA torture manual on De Niro's desk. Well, the CIA, who reviewed the script and reviews many scripts in Hollywood, said, no, you can't do that. So they ended up just having photos of De Niro with Bin Laden and Clinton and different things. So, a lot of what we watch on TV, in the movies, and read in the newspaper, a lot of that is clear through the CIA, if not utterly, based on CIA misinformation that they feed to the press.
And let me connect these dots. I found the story. And here's the headline. This is from NBC News. In a break with the past, now that's a lie, U.S. is using intel to fight an info war with Russia, even when the intel isn't rock solid. It doesn't have to be solid intelligence, one U.S. official said. It's more important to get out ahead of them, the Russians, Putin specifically, before they do something. So this is NBC admitting that they're using less than accurate intel in stories that they're telling to the American public. They're basically lying in order to further a narrative. And we can take this back to the Iraq War with the Office of Special Plans, which was set up in the Pentagon to take intel that hadn't been vetted and spin it into stories that would support the U.S. narrative about why the United States needed to, the whole idea of weapons of mass destruction and Dick Cheney's letter about yellow cake uranium coming from Niger. Okay, why are we getting into these weeds? Because the United States government is attacking American citizens, independent journalists, for telling the truth about stories that are challenging the standard narrative when the United States government admits itself it's lying to you. And this is in violation of the First Amendment. Professor Dan Kovalik, is that a good summation of the issue?
It's a very good summation. You'll often hear, for example, someone like myself will say, oh, there's neo-Nazis in Ukraine, which, by the way, before 2022, even a lot of the mainstream press reported on that, right?
I want to say even Barack Obama said one of the reasons we don't want to send weapons to Ukraine is because we don't want to give weapons to the Nazis.
Yeah, not only did Barack Obama talk about it, there was a law passed by Congress that I think Obama signed saying that the U.S. could not fund neo-Nazis in Ukraine. Well, I don't think they passed the law just because theoretically there might be, because they knew there were Nazis in Ukraine. And then, in fact, that law was repealed because they later decided, oh, well, we need to support Nazis in Ukraine. Okay, so everyone admitted there's Nazis in Ukraine. Then once the special military operations of Russia began in February of 2022, all of the press all of a sudden pretended, oh, there's no Nazis there. Okay, so now after that, if someone like me, who's actually been to the Donbass, which was part of Ukraine, says, oh yeah, there's neo-Nazis in Ukraine, they're like, well, that's a Putin talking point. Well, the fact it's a Putin talking point doesn't mean it's untrue. If Putin says the world is round, it doesn't mean the world is flat. I mean, right? So, but that's what's happening. And that is really the claim leveled against people who are trying to give a more balanced picture of what's happening in Ukraine, as they're being, portrayed as somehow being controlled by the Kremlin, when in fact they're just saying what the truth is, even though, yeah, it may happen to correspond with what the Kremlin is saying, which I will say, I find the Kremlin a lot more credible on many of these issues than the White House. But, other people have to judge that. But again, the fact that my views may overlap with those of the Kremlin at times doesn't mean I'm under their sway.
And let me give the reference, those who want to look this up for themselves. The headline of the story is, in a break with the past, U.S. is using intel to fight an info war with Russia, even when the intel isn't rock solid. And the story is from April 6th, 2022, written by Ken Delanian and others. And again, it's important to remember that, again, Ken Delanian was dismissed from the LA Times for writing stories, for sending stories to the CIA, having the CIA edit the stories, not telling the editors at the LA Times that this was being done. So again, this shows you the kind of work and the kind of propaganda that is being sold to you as news. Now, there's another element to this, because as we talked about before, there are a number of facets of this, and that is, again, in consortium news, pro-Palestine students and faculty sue UC Santa Cruz. The lawsuit seeks to vindicate the fundamental democratic and constitutional rights to free speech, free assembly, and due process against overreach by university authorities. So basically what has happened, and this story was last week, September 11th, 2024. So if you all remember, back in the spring, there were a number of protests across college campuses all over this country in support of the Palestinian efforts, and they were protesting against the genocidal action of Israel against Palestinians that the United States is supporting. And a number of students were arrested, and some students that were arrested at UC Santa Barbara or UC Santa Cruz,
right,
in the spring, have now still been put off campus in violation of campus regulation. So they are suing the University of Santa Cruz to have that overturned. And just Tuesday, the University of Maryland now finds that CAIR, the Council of American Islamic Relations, the Palestine Legal, they are suing University of Maryland for canceling, and this is who would ever think to do something this horrific, Jewish and Palestinian student groups holding an interfaith vigil. Dan Kovalik, the country's going to hell in a handbasket.
Yeah, absolutely. It's outrageous. I mean, what we see is violations of the First Amendment in many different ways, not only the violation of free speech, of freedom of assembly, but of course, freedom of religion, because, of course, interfaith vigil would be an expression of religion. I don't see how these actions by Santa Cruz, which, by the way, is part of the University of California system, that's a public school system. It means they are subject to the First Amendment. I don't see how those actions can stand. If they do stand, if the courts allow them to stand, then we have entered a brave new world, my friend. I mean, a very dangerous world. By any precedent of the court, at least recent precedent, they should be permitted to have these types of protests and vigils. And I hope they win in the courts. They should win.
In fact, I remember saying after September 11th, as we looked at the crackdown that the United States government was imposing upon American citizens, that when a country violates its own constitution in reaction to action taken by terrorists, the terrorists have won.
Yeah, well, that's absolutely true. And of course, what we saw after 9/11 was an abomination in terms of the rights, not just of U.S. citizens, but of others that were curtailed, the people put in Guantanamo Bay without charge, right? It turned out most of them had done nothing. Some died in jail, right? Some died of torture. It was a huge mark on American democracy. I believe there's still people there. It has not.
There are.
I think there's a couple survivors still hanging on. It's an amazing thing. And of course, then you had, Barack Obama, who decided he could murder American citizens with drones abroad on his own authority. And, he killed one man who was claimed to have been a terrorist. Again, that had never been proven. Right, that he had not been proven in a court of law, and then incredibly, they murdered his son, his 16-year-old son. And in defense, one of the White House spokespeople said, "Well, he chose the wrong father."
Eric Holder came out and said when he was the Attorney General that an American president can execute American citizens anywhere in the world without judicial review.
Yeah, incredible. An incredible thing. And it's bad enough, frankly, Wilmer, that the government has done these sorts of things. But the sad part also is there's been so little resistance to this, so little criticism. And that's what allows these things to continue, and not only continue, but to escalate.
Quickly going back to the campus issue. So we're told that there has to be this prohibition against protesting in support of the Palestinians because we have to be mindful of the sensitivities of Jewish students. And we can't have these Jewish American students feeling threatened and feeling unsafe on the college campuses amidst these peaceful protests, ignoring the fact that a lot of the protesters are the very Jewish students who the authorities claim their rights are being protected. I submit to you, Attorney Kovalik, that is merely a cover or a pretext for the protection of these interests of these students is a pretext, is a cover that is being used by the government to violate our First Amendment rights, the same way the Israeli government claims it has to engage in genocide of Palestinians as it attacks Hamas.
No, exactly right. Because, the other issue, I mean, of course, you're right that many Jews are protesting for Palestinians. But also, what about the Palestinians' rights? There's Palestinian students on campus. There's Arab students. What about their rights? Right?
What about my rights? I'm neither Palestinian nor Jewish, and I have this problem, and I know I'm nuts, Dan. I got a problem with genocide. Okay, I admit it. I admit it, America. I admit it to the world. I got a problem with genocide.
It's an incredible thing, Wilmer. You know, what we've all been taught since World War II is that the worst crime in the world is genocide, right?
Mm-hmm.
It is the high crime. It is the most abominable crime. And even one of the worst things you could say about someone is they're a genocide denier, right?
Oh, yeah. Heaven forbid.
And now all of a sudden, when people are protesting against genocide, they're the bad guys. And yeah, it's an incredible thing that is happening. It's an amazing Rubicon we've crossed. And no one can really defend it. And that's the problem. And that is why there's repression. The universities, including some of the best in the world, like Columbia University, which may be the main offender on this, they can't defend their actions. They can't defend the genocide. They can't defend against those saying it's a genocide. So they've decided we just have to shut the speech down because we, as an institution, have no argument. We can't ideologically defend this. We can't ideologically defend the United States. And so we're just going to say, students, you can't talk, which goes against every notion that anyone has about what the university is supposed to be, a space of free speech and free debate. And Zionists should have a right to their views. They should have a right to peacefully protest, and those who are against Zionism and the genocide should also have that right. And that is so obvious and so clear. And the fact that the universities have decided to go the other way and only repress one kind of speech, and that is pro-Palestinian and not pro-Israel, it's abominable. It just shows the corruption of our institutions, from the universities all the way to the White House.
And it also, I believe, shows the power of the military-industrial complex, or what Ray McGovern called the Mickey Mat, in that once you start challenging the narrative via free speech, you now threaten the defense budget. You now start threatening the billions of dollars in weapons that are being wasted in Ukraine, that are being wasted in Gaza, that are being wasted as the United States is trying to foment a Middle East war. And heaven forbid, those billion-dollar contracts that are going to Lockheed Martin, that are going to Boeing, that are going to GE, Raytheon, heaven forbid, people start asking questions about why is so much money being wasted on genocide.
Yeah, no, exactly. That's correct. When we look around our cities, we look around this country, we see so many problems that need fixing. And people are saying, hey, why aren't you fixing our problems instead of sending money abroad to these wars in Ukraine and Gaza? Those are very inconvenient people to the powers that be. And not just to the military-industrial complex, but apparently we know that in the case of Columbia University, that they responded to calls by billionaires in New York City who asked them to repress the protests. So we know the ruling class is very much in the tank for Israel, very much in the tank for the genocide in Gaza, and that they are influencing these universities and how they respond to this.
And let's connect another dot, and that is the trial in Tampa, Florida, that just wrapped up last week in the Uhuru, the African People's Socialist Party, also known as the Uhuru movement or the Uhuru 3. There was an incredibly confusing verdict that came down in that trial. It was alleged that the defendants were doing the bidding of the Russian government by sowing discord in America's political process by promoting political views that were contrary to those of the United States government and favorable to those of the Russian government. Mm-hmm. Now, I got to reiterate, they're not talking about overthrowing the government.
Right.
They're not talking about attacking the government. Sowing discord, their own words, in America's political process by promoting political views, not military, political views that are contrary to those of the United States government. So, well, go ahead, Dan. You want to say something?
Yeah, well, that's exactly what the First Amendment is supposed to protect. Are controversial views that go against the government. I mean, right? You don't need the First Amendment to protect speech that is pro-government, right? I mean, that's kind of obvious. If the First Amendment only protected pro-government speech, it wouldn't be much of a protection at all. You know, as people say, you know, you have to protect inconvenient speech and dissident speech. And so it's amazing that this prosecution went forward. Apparently, I guess they were convicted of conspiracy, but not some of the other charges. And by the way, let's say a couple things about it. First of all, I'm not sure they influenced anyone. I never heard of this organization, to be totally honest, until this indictment came down.
Mm-hmm.
And so number one, so they don't have much influence at all. Number two, I think this was over like $500 in a donation they got for some Russian. $500. Meanwhile, AIPAC is giving over $100 million in this election cycle to people's election campaigns. You know, AIPAC owns
and Cory Bush lost because of those efforts, and Jamal Bowman in New York lost because of those efforts. So not only is AIPAC donating, and it's $100 million by their admission in the New York Times, they were successful in their efforts.
Yeah, they claim they were successful in every effort. Every person they backed won. And, you know, this has been true for years, of course, right. This type of influence. In fact, John F. Kennedy tried to make AIPAC liable under the Foreign Agent Registration Act, which is the act that the Aruru group was prosecuted. And of course, Kennedy was not able to do so, and he was actually killed shortly after. You can draw your own conclusions. AIPAC has been this huge elephant in the living room, a huge, influencer of American politics for many, many years. And yet, who's getting prosecuted for that? No one. They go after these small fish
to make a big point.
Yeah.
Small fish to make a big point.
Right.
And so this was an incredibly bizarre verdict because they weren't, as you mentioned, they weren't found guilty of failing to register as agents of the Russian government. They were convicted of conspiring to fail to register as agents of the government.
Incredible. It's absolutely incredible.
So the jury said that Chairman Omali Yeshitela and the other two defendants agreed to become unregistered agents of the Russian government, but didn't actually become agents of the Russian government.
They wanted to be agents, but Russia didn't care. They didn't want them to be agents, whatever. It's absolutely bizarre. And that, we could talk about this all day. I mean, again, I'm a lawyer. I study criminal law. And, that sort of, to get someone on that becomes just a thought crime. Because they literally did nothing.
Which, by the way, isn't a crime.
Right. No, you're right. I mean, again, because that would be a First Amendment violation. We're not supposed to prosecute thoughts. And the idea is, I wanted to do something. Well, that's not enough to convict someone. I mean, it's completely outrageous. And I think their case is on appeal, if I'm not mistaken. If it is, I really hope they win. I mean, God bless them. They really are the test case here for the rest of us. I mean, I think the government went after this small group that no one heard of because they figured no one would support them. They go after them first, make some bad precedent for the rest of us, then start going after the rest of us. So, which means it's a very, very important case.
And the prosecution, the government, was unable to present hardly any witnesses. They had hardly any evidence because this was 95% fiction. It was just flat fiction. And I think what also the government didn't expect was the attention that this was going to bring. The courtroom was full of supporters for the Uhuru. They've been around since about 1972, and they've done incredible work in the communities that they work in. And so now, final data point. As I understand it, you, Dan Kovalik, were coming back into this country last week?
Yeah, last Friday. Yeah.
I'll let you tell the story.
Yeah, so I was coming back from the anti-fascist Congress in Venezuela.
You're anti-fascist?
Yeah,
wait a minute. See, I knew when I saw that white jacket. When I saw that white jacket,
something was bad. Yeah, they used to say they were premature anti-fascist. I guess that's what I am. But anyway, I came back through Bolivia, and to make a long story short, I was held for 4 hours. I was interrogated.
Where? What airport?
In Miami, which is not the airport you really do want to come back through. But I was asked about my travels, about who I meet with, about my connections, my political beliefs.
They asked you about your political beliefs.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, it was all about, what countries do you like? What countries do you not like? And where do you, what countries, where do you feel most comfortable? What countries you're most afraid of? I said, honestly, the one I'm in right now, because I get treated like this. And then,
what was their reaction to that answer?
Well, they were a little defensive, but, tried to, continue with the conversation. And then, well, even before they got deeply into the questioning, they searched all my bags and took my cell phone and my computer. By the end of the evening, I did get my computer back, but my phone I did not get back. And I just got it back this morning.
Oh, okay.
So that would have been about 3 or 4 days they had it. And we know, I mean, you can Google this. There's a lot of stories about it. They have the right outside New York City. Okay, and we can get into the exception. Outside of JFK and LaGuardia, they have the right everywhere else to take your phone and copy the whole thing, copy your computer, which I imagine they've done, which is an incredible privacy violation. As you can imagine, most people have a heart attack if that happened to them. And it was clear it was motivated by my trips to Russia, Venezuela, other countries. And in fact, I've been subject to secondary interrogation, which is what it's called, at the border, in the airports, a number of times since I first started going to Russia about 2 years ago. I've been stopped. That was probably my 4th or 5th time being stopped. And I was told in Chicago when I was stopped some months ago that I have a case number with the State Department, that marked me for this type of interrogation. So, and other people like Danny Shaw, who's a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, he also was stopped.
Friend of ours.
Yeah, stopped for 3 hours. His phone was taken. I mean, he's Scott Ritter.
That was in Chicago. Danny was stopped in Chicago.
Scott Ritter's house in New York was raided by the FBI. They took his phone and computer. So look, the hunt is on. There's no question about that. I do want to give one caveat. I mentioned this exception in New York City. There is a judge in New York, the federal court in New York, who held in her court district, in her court jurisdiction, which covers JFK and LaGuardia, they cannot take your computer and phone without a search warrant. So people out there, Wilmer, if you're doing international travel, try to come back through JFK because,
I was just going to thank you. I was just going to ask you about the warrant because this seems to be another violation. You're supposed to be secure in your person and your papers. Last I checked, and I'm not a lawyer. I did go to law school, and I did stay at Holiday Inn Express. So So there seem to be a number of violations beyond the First Amendment when they start to detain you and they start to seize your property without warrants.
Yes. Well, the problem we have, Wilmer, is outside the jurisdiction in New York.
Mm-hmm.
The courts have held that Customs has the right to hold you even up to 72 hours, Wilmer, without a lawyer, interrogate you, and to take your phone, computer, and copy it. They have held that until you get through the Customs and immigration,
you're not officially in the country.
You're not in the United States of America. The Constitution does not apply to you. That's an incredible, incredible thing. Most Americans have no idea of it, and most Americans won't experience the repercussions of that.
Right.
But what that means until you go through, passport control and get your bag and go through those double doors and push on those double doors and go into the main terminal, they really have the power of God over you. And again, most people have no idea about that. And so what the government's decided to do is, okay, we're not going to even worry about getting a warrant. We won't even send the FBI to Dan Kovalik's home. We don't have to do that. We wait till he leaves the country, comes back, because he travels all the time, and we'll do things to him and take things from him we could never do without a warrant and without an attorney being present if he's interrogated, etc. It's an incredible violation of our rights, as you say, Wilmer, but it is totally sanctioned, at least at this moment, by the courts, except for that court in New York City.
So how did they and where did they approach you? You're coming through the jetway. You're coming off you're deplaning.
Right.
You're coming through the jetway. So when you come out of the jetway to the terminal, what happened?
Well, so just as almost every time, so only one time this happened to me in Chicago recently, they were waiting for me off the plane, right outside the plane.
Oh,
yeah, that was
jetway.
Yeah, the only time that happened. In fact, as we were descending, they announced in the plane as we were descending, please have your passports ready when you exit the plane. They checked everyone's passports. When they got to me, they stopped checking because they had their guy and they took me to be interrogated. Now, there was only time that happened. Every other time, including this time in Miami, I get off the plane. I walk all that way. Usually it's a long walk all the way to passport control. I get in line. I get up to the passport agent. She checks my passport, had a few questions. And I'm thinking, maybe I'm going to, be okay this time. And then she said, please stand over there. And I knew what that meant.
Go stand. Did you say go stand in the corner?
Yeah,
and face the wall?
Basically. And she put a little orange slip over my passport. And another guy comes out. He takes my passport and says, come with me. And I'm brought into another room with a bunch of other people. And I sat there for probably an hour. Other people were getting processed very quickly. I took, after an hour, a customs officer came and said, please come with me with your baggage. And she said, now she begins, I'm sorry, Wilmer, she lied. Okay. She begins to make up this story. She says, you're subject to a random drug search from Bolivia because a lot of people are bringing in drugs. So we're going to check your bags. And then I'm going to ask you a few questions. We'll let you go. And this is just a random. But she checks all my bags. That she does.
Mm-hmm.
But she doesn't have a sniffer dog, right? And she doesn't check my prescription pill bottles, which could have drugs in them. She didn't check my coffee I brought in, which could have drugs in them. Clearly this is theater.
Mm-hmm.
And she says, as part of our search, we can take your phone and your computer. We're going to do that. But we're only going to search for issues related to drugs, whether you told someone you have drugs or you swallowed drugs. And, but then when she takes me to another room for interrogation, there's no questions about drugs. It's all about what countries do you visit? Do you meet with government officials? Do you know government officials? Do you know presidents of other countries? Again, what countries do you feel comfortable in? What countries do you not feel comfortable in? That sort of thing, which indicates that was the real reason for me being pulled over, was my travels and political beliefs, not the drug stuff. That was just a lie, I think, to get me feeling comfortable enough to talk to them. So there you go. That's what happened. Again, it took me days to get my phone back. Again, you can read about it. The Customs now copies thousands of phones a year. They put them on a database. All of that information is on the database for 15 years. And all 3,000 customs officials have access to it. So, some guy in Oklahoma who's bored during his lunch can go eat his sandwich and look at my data. I mean, it's an amazing thing, Wilmer. Again, most Americans have no idea this is happening.
Wow. The land of the free and the home of the brave.
Indeed.
So, and it's also important for people to understand this is happening during a Democratic administration.
Yes, and especially because it's Democratic. We know from the New York Times, an article about 3 weeks ago, talked about the FBI investigating people for connections with Russia and RT. And they said specifically that this was ordered by President Joe Biden. So this is not an accident. This isn't just the bureaucracy doing what they do or the deep state. This has been ordered by a Democratic president to happen.
And we also know that more whistleblowers were prosecuted during the Obama administration than any other administration in history.
Indeed.
Dan Kovalik, Professor Dan Kovalik. Man, thank you so much for your time. I truly appreciate. First of all, I'm very sorry that you as an American went through this. I'm even more aggrieved that you as a friend went through this. Thank you for joining me today.
Wilmer, it's always a pleasure, and you are a friend, and I admire you a lot, and I look forward to the next time we talk.
Well, man, appreciate it. And folks, thank you all so much for listening to the Connecting the Dots podcast with me, Dr. Wilmer Leon. Stay tuned for new episodes every week. Also, please follow and subscribe, leave a review, share the show. Follow us on social media. You can see all the links below in the show description. And remember, this is where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge. Talk without analysis is just chatter, and we don't chatter here on Connecting the Dots. See you again next time. Until then, I'm Dr. Wilmer Leon. Have a great one. Peace. I'm out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.